It's time for the Daily Ember. Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 28 of the Daily Ember. I am your host and the founder of Berning Media Network, Patrick Vincent. Today is Wednesday, December 13th, and I hope you've all had a fantastic week so far, and would also like to remind you that if you're not already subscribed to our podcast, you can do just that on Apple Podcast and Google Music, and coming soon we will also be uploading them to our YouTube channel. Starting this week, we will also be featuring independent bands and artists in between segments, and today's band is Army of Infants, a two-piece funky psychedelic band with members Jared playing the guitar and Jake on drums. They both sing, with Jared mostly on the leads. So now let's dive on into the news so far this week so we can get to those jams. To start off today's episode, a uranium company urged Donald Trump to carve up Bears Ears National Monument. Then he did just that. Now, the Washington Post discovered a campaign by Energy Fuels Resources, a United States subsidiary of a Canadian firm, urging the Trump administration to dramatically reduce Bears Ears. The company reached out just months before Trump announced he was slashing the 1.35 million acre site down to 202,000 acres. Company CEO Mark Chalmers complained in a May 25th letter to Interior Secretary Ryan Zink that the national monument protections could affect existing and future mill operations of the company, which owns a mill adjacent of Bears Ears. He also went on to add that there are also many other known uranium and vanadium deposits that could provide valuable energy and mineral resources in the future. Zink has insisted that the president's push to reduce national monuments has nothing to do with mining interests. This is not about energy, Zink told reporters last week in an interview. There is no mine within Bears Ears, but the president's redrawn boundaries of Bear Ears now puts the uranium deposits outside the protected area. Utah's Republican Governor Gary Herbert pointed it out in an interview with the Washington Post also. Now, Energy Fuels Resource also paid $30,000 to lobbying firm Fargay Baker Daniels to push for the change throughout this year, according to the Federal Records, the newspaper reported. The lobbying teams was headed by Andrew Wheeler, whom Donald Trump was tapped to be Deputy Secretary of the Environmental Protection Agency. Wheeler is currently awaiting Senate confirmation. Members of the energy firm also had a private meeting about Bears Ears with Zink advisors, according to the Washington Post article as well. Trump has blasted the national monuments as a massive giveaway to the public. He ordered Zink earlier this year to review 27 sites and make recommendations about their future. When Trump traveled to Utah earlier this month to gut both Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase national monuments, he blasted them as an abuse of the Antiques Act. The abuses have not just threatened your local economies, they've threatened your very way of life, Trump said. They've threatened your hearts. He said his actions reverse federal overreach and restore the rights of this land to your citizens. Public lands will once again be for public use. Which, is a really way of saying, hey, I got funded by a bunch of lobbyists to redraw these lands and give the land away to these mining companies, but hey, we'll just figure that out when the time comes along. Bears Ears is sacred to the Navajo, and a coalition of Indian tribes has already filed suit to block Donald Trump's plan, arguing that he has overstepped congressional power in his move to seize public land. Another suit by a group of environmental groups and activist retailer Patagonia was also filed last week to block the Bears Ears cuts. And on top of those lawsuits, another lawsuit by a coalition of environmental groups as well as another one by conservation groups and archaeologists were filed last week in the United States District Court of the District of Columbia to block Trump's carving up of the Grand Staircase monument. Now, Trump's proclamation would cut in half the 1.9 million acre site the nation's largest land national monument. Now, the Utah reductions together would represent the largest reduction of national monuments in American history. In a statement, Brian Serbert, who is the executive director of the Conservation Lands Foundation, he said that this is as bad as we expected, based on the lies and misrepresentations that we have heard throughout Interior Secretary Zink's sham he calls a review. He continued to say that this administration will stop at nothing to ensure that their private industry cronies can profit from the destruction of even our most highly valued public lands, to the point of undoing protections that have been in place for 2 decades. The suit that Serbert's group is involved in argues that Trump unconstitutionally and illegally assumed congressional powers in reducing an established national monument to arrange the decimation of one of the most renowned conservation sites in the country, with thousands of sensitive scientific, historic, prehistoric, archaeological, cultural, and even natural resources located across its landscape. Now, Trump's planned diminishment of protections causes harm to the organizations, businesses, and individuals who value the monument and depend on its status and the protections such designation affords for advancing scientific research, their livelihoods, and their enjoyment and spiritual fulfillment, this suit reads. Now, this action harms the American people by undermining the protection of key treasured portions of our nation's public lands legacy. That's all I have for you guys currently on this story. As always, I'll give you more as I learn more. In this next segment, I'll be going over how a United Nations official was shocked by the toxic conditions in the United States Black Belt, saying that it is the worst poverty in a first world country. But first, before we dive into that, you'll hear a song by Army of Infants titled Gay. And if you like what you hear, please make sure to check them out on their Bandcamp page. Next up, I'll be going over the extreme poverty, environmental degradation, and toxic hazards in poor communities in the United States that are facing increased international scrutiny following an inspection of rural Alabama communities by a United Nations official. The condition struck the official as shocking and completely out of step with prevailing conditions in the wealthy, developed world. The tour by Philip Alton, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, has cast a light on an issue known well to poverty-blighted communities and oppressed nationalities in the United States: inequitable local policies that safeguard environmental racism by literally concentrating toxic hazards in the backyards of the poor. In a statement, Elton said, "Some might ask why a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights would visit a country as rich as the United States. But despite great wealth in the United States, there also exists great poverty and inequality. The United Nations official tour aims to provide transparency to the human rights violations, destitution, and lack of access to crucial basic services that have blighted oppressed communities throughout the United States." United Nations investigators have also toured cities and towns in California and Alabama, as well as Washington, D.C., West Virginia, and the colonial territory of Puerto Rico. According to Elton, the level of degradation he found can only be compared to the disparities that exist in the poor peripheries of the global economy, where the vast majority of people have known little besides maldevelopment, impoverishment, and the institutional violence of inequality. While on a tour of a rural Butler County community, Elton witnessed raw sewage flowing from homes through exposed PVC pipes and into open trenches and pits, with one of the home's water line running straight through a pit of sewage. He said in a statement, "I think it's very uncommon in the first world. This is not a sight that one would normally see. I'd have to say that I haven't seen this before in any other first world country." Prior to the Civil War, the southern Alabama region was a cotton farming area where antebellum plantation owners exploited the labor of thousands of black slaves on vast estates. The United States Census Bureau estimates that nearly 41 million people in the United States live in poverty, ranking the country as the second highest in terms of poverty rates among wealthy countries. That's right, the United States ranks number 2 in the highest poverty rates in wealthy nations. The income disparities and general disposition of oppressed nationalities such as Black, Native American, and Latino communities are reflected by a denial of civil rights, disproportionate levels of exposure to hazardous industrial waste, as well as displacement and subjection at the hands of local authorities who often shoot first and ask questions later. The violence of grinding poverty in the United States has spawned disease outbreaks in the United States that are more typical of nations with substandard sanitary conditions, while in the recent weeks, hepatitis A outbreaks have been reported in San Diego, Maine, and southeast Michigan. In Butler County and Lowndes County, Elton also investigated a recent outbreak of E. coli and hookworm, the latter of which is a 19th century disease commonly found in regions like South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, according to an article from The Guardian. Now, while health experts assume that the basic advances in sanitation caused hookworm to disappear in the 1980s, recent studies reveal that the parasitic disease continues to thrive on a breathtaking scale, especially in areas like Lowndes County, Alabama, an impoverished region lacking waste disposal infrastructure where 73% of the majority black population have reported raw sewage inundating in their homes due to faulty septic tanks. The prevalence of such disease is also rooted in a lack of consistent access to clean drinking water, which is often contaminated by the raw sewage influence from homes that is spread across forests and grassy fields whenever it rains, spreading the waste and pathogens it contains, generating toxic conditions, repulsive visuals, and an overwhelming stench, according to AI.com. These two pipes are the raw sewage pipes coming from the house, and you've got your main water line here, and it may have a hole in it, so everyone gets sick all at once, local resident and activist Aaron Thigpen said. Elton said in another statement that there is a human right for people to live decently, and that means that the government has an obligation to provide people with the essentials of life, which include power, water, and sewage service. But if the government says, "Oh no, we're not going to do it," and leaves you to install a very expensive septic tanks, and that's not how it should work. Elton stressed that governments play an instrumental role in addressing the environmental inequalities, illnesses arising from exposure to hazardous waste and other toxic byproducts of systematic racism. In spite of such clear threats to public safety and social rights, however, the Republican Party is set to pass a tax bill that will shred what remains of United States residents' nearly non-existent social safety net, while the Democratic Party has offered very little more than lip service in its lackadaisical resistance to the offensive being waged by the ultra-rich in the era of Trump. The idea of human rights is that people have basic dignity, and that is the role of the government, yes, the government, to ensure that no one falls below the decent level, Alton said. He finished it off by saying, civilized society doesn't say for people to go and make it on your own, and if you can't, bad luck. That's all I have for you guys currently on this story. Please make sure to stick around for the next segment where I'll be going over how the Dallas police chief says that millennials are to blame for the police officer shortage. But before we dive into that, we have another track coming from Army of Infants. This one's name is Control. Again, if you like what you hear, go and support them on their Bandcamp and give them a follow and buy some merch. Let's dive into this jam. In this segment, I'll be reading about how the Dallas Police Department is working to make up for a shortage of police officers. Chief Renee Hall told City Council members on Monday about some new strategies to fill these positions. Chief Hall is looking at everything from rewarding officers who recruit candidates to eliminating some of the automatic disqualifiers like minor drug use for someone's past. Both the Dallas Police Department and Dallas Fire Rescue are struggling to find people who want to protect and serve. Both chiefs told City Council members that the millennial generation is partly to blame. Chief Hall said in a statement, "We have nights, weekends, and holidays available, not attractive to millennials who want all days off and to be the chief in 6 months. We recognize that this is a challenge." Dallas Fire Chief David Codeney said that the other challenge is they're job hopping every 5 years. But both chiefs said they're also challenged with starting pay that is lower than neighboring cities. Chief Hall, who is faced with a 4% increase in violent crime from year to year, needs to hire 250 cops this fiscal year. She said she's behind schedule. To catch up, she's come up with some new ideas. In January, Chief Hall will roll out a program that will give a total of 4 to 6 days off for officers that recruit someone who is hired and graduates from the academy. She plans to start recruiting Dallas ISD students and hiring them as public service officers until they can be peace officers at age 19 and a half. She says it is within her power as chief to hire applicants who would currently not qualify because they admit to infractions like minor drug use. We recognize that when you're 17 and you do something silly or stupid, you're a different person when you're 24, Chief Hall said in another statement. The Dallas Police Association hopes something works out soon. Crime is still rising, said DPA President Mike Mata. We have to do what we can to bring those numbers down. Chief Codeney, whose department has run out of ambulances on occasion this year, said he's working to shorten his department's long application process. We've changed our entire hiring process, he said. Now we have an open hiring period. People can apply at any time. To work on better retention for officers, Chief Hall plans to start a pilot program to let officers who live in Dallas take home their patrol cars as well. That's all I have, you guys, on this story. I'll give you more as I learn more, as always. In the next segment, I'll be going over how, faced with investigation, Munchin admits to lying about middle-class tax hikes. In this final segment, I'll be going over the GOP tax scam. Republicans have consistently assured the American people their scheme to make the middle class pay for massive corporate tax breaks would not cost the government a penny because the economy would grow to replace the lost revenue. Now, Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, was a big proponent of this idea. He not only promised tax cuts for the rich that were free, but he said his department was working on a study that would prove it. After several weeks, commentators began to question whether this study even existed, prompting an investigation by the Inspector General of the Treasury into what Munchin's team was doing all that time. Now, Munchin has finally released his much-touted study, which is 1 page long and says the exact opposite of what he promised. Treasury's Office of Tax Policy has modeled the Senate Finance Tax Reform Plan and overall has similar analysis to the Joint Committee on Taxation on a static basis with a score of approximately negative $1.5 trillion on a current law basis and approximately minus $1 trillion on a current policy basis. The report goes on to say that the Senate tax bill will pay for itself, but only if the economy grows at 2.9% every year for a decade. This is virtually impossible. As experts estimate, you would need to add 40 million people to the United States population to get growth of that height. Even Munchin's own report acknowledges that the tax bill alone cannot grow the economy that much. Rather, it assumes that there will be a regulatory reform, infrastructure developed, and welfare reform that kicks in next year to make up the difference, which defeats the whole purpose of trying to study the impact of the tax cuts alone. Essentially, underneath all the flimsy hypotheticals, Munchin is admitting that he lied. Like the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, the Treasury simply could not balance the math. Republicans in Congress derided every previous report showing their plan would increase the federal deficit, but this latest is impossible to ignore. Even the Trump administration officials, using the most favorable assumptions, could not support the idea that we can give the rich free money. Munchin's bluff was called, and it turned out that he had no other cards to play besides the bullshit he threw on the table. That's all I have for you guys currently on the GOP tax scam. I'll go more in depth on it in future episodes. That's all I have for you guys on today's episode. I hope you enjoyed what we went over today. Please make sure to follow our official Daily Ember Instagram page, and also don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to us on. If you'd like to support our show, make sure to donate to our PayPal at paypal.me/Berning Media Network or become a Patreon on our Patreon website. I'm your host, Patrick Vincent, and before I wrap up this episode, we have one final song from the Army of Infants called Cicada 3301. So please make sure to listen to that song, and if you liked any of the songs we played by them today, once again, go to armyofinfants.bandcamp.com and go follow them and support them by purchasing some merch.
Singing,